Have you ever had a day so special that you counted down every hour, every minute, just waiting for it to start? That was exactly how I felt that morning. Oh, but let me introduce myself first. I'm Margaret, living alone in a cozy little house in Portland, Oregon. It's the kind of place where you can hear birds singing every morning and the gentle patter of rain in the winter. Honestly, though, sometimes the quiet can be too much. So when my grandson Ethan called to say he was coming to visit, it felt like I woke up from a long nap. Ethan is my absolute favorite grandchild. Though, to be fair, he's my only grandchild. He's 22, studying at a college in Boston, and to be honest, I don't get to see him nearly as much as I'd like. His visit was like a fresh breeze sweeping through my life, shaking off the monotony. But here's the twist. When I opened the door, it wasn't just Ethan standing there. Next to him was another young man, tall, black, with a hesitant smile, like he wasn't quite sure he belonged. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit of his when he's nervous, and said, "Grandma, this is Jordan, my roommate. I brought him along. Hope that's okay?" How do you think I reacted? I laughed out loud and said, "For heaven's sake, why wouldn't it be? Come on in, both of you." And just like that, our day turned into more than a family reunion. It became the start of welcoming a stranger into my little world. Now let me ask you, how would you feel if a total stranger suddenly became part of your home? Would you be open to it? Or would it make you uneasy? Stick with me, because what happened next was far more interesting than I could have imagined. Let me tell you about lunch that day. A classic, grandma-style meal, overflowing with so much food the table barely had room for our plates. I'd prepared a hearty roast, creamy mashed potatoes, rich gravy, and of course, my famous apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter. Ethan and Jordan sat around the table chatting like old friends, though they hadn't known each other all that long. Ethan, ever the enthusiastic storyteller, couldn't stop regaling us with tales from college. "Grandma, did you know Jordan is like a magnet for women?" Ethan said, laughing and pointing his fork at his friend. "I'm not even kidding. Everywhere we go, people stare at him like he's some kind of movie star." Jordan just chuckled, lifting his glass of lemonade. "I don't do it on purpose," he said, his voice calm, his tone humble but with a hint of humor. "Maybe they just like approachable guys." I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head. "Jordan, with a smile like yours. I'm not surprised at all. There was something so effortless about him, a natural charm that drew people in. And I'll admit, there was a moment I caught myself looking at him a bit longer than I should have. But hey, I'm an adult. I can control my thoughts. Or so I told myself. After lunch, the three of us went out to the front yard to enjoy the summer sunshine. Ethan surveyed the overgrown lawn and said, "Grandma, this yard is looking a little wild." I feigned a stern look. "Are you saying I don't take care of my house?" Jordan burst out laughing. "That's not what he meant, Mrs. Margaret. What Ethan's trying to say is, we'd be happy to help, right, Ethan?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically, and the two young men got to work. Ethan attacked the hedges with a pair of clippers, while Jordan handled the lawnmower, taking on the overgrown grass. I sat on the porch with an iced coffee, watching them. Ethan, true to form, was clumsy and hasty, while Jordan moved with a calm, deliberate grace. The afternoon sun lit up Jordan's skin, highlighting the sweat that clung to his white t-shirt and the muscles rippling beneath it. I caught myself, staring again, and quickly turned away, scolding myself silently. "Margaret, he's just a young man helping out. Don't let your mind wander." But you know what? Sitting there alone, I couldn't help but feel something I hadn't felt in years, like my house was alive again, buzzing with energy. That night, after a day filled with laughter and life, my home settled back into its usual quiet. Ethan went to bed early, and I assumed Jordan had retired to the guest room. I tried to read a few pages of my book, but I couldn't focus. Images of Jordan kept creeping into my mind, his laughter, the way he spoke, and even the kind smile he gave me when he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret," after dinner. Lying in bed, I told myself to stop overthinking. "Margaret, you're 67 years old. He's just a guest. Don't make things weird." But deep down, a tiny rebellious voice whispered back, "He makes you feel alive, like you're more than just an old lady." Unable to shake the thoughts, I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed by the guest room, I noticed the faint glow of light coming from inside. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I saw Jordan sitting on the edge of the bed, his laptop balanced on his knees. The light from the screen illuminated his face, and for a moment I just stood there, debating whether to knock. "Jordan," I finally called softly. He looked up, startled, and quickly closed the laptop. "Oh, Mrs. Margaret, I didn't realize you were still awake." I stepped inside, holding my glass. "Couldn't sleep. I saw the light and thought I'd check on you. Everything okay?" He smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, just watching a movie. Nothing serious." "What kind of movie?" I asked, moving a bit closer. He hesitated, then answered, "A horror film. The Conjuring." "It's not bad," I laughed. "Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Horror's never been my thing. My old heart couldn't take it." "Stay if you'd like," he offered, sliding over on the bed to make room. "I don't mind the company." Against my better judgment, I sat down. We watched in silence for a while, but I wasn't really paying attention to the movie. I was far too aware of Jordan sitting so close, his presence warm and steady. When a jump scare made me flinch, he chuckled softly. "Don't worry, Mrs. Margaret. I've got you." His words were meant to be light-hearted, but they stirred something deep inside me, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to experience in years. I told myself, "Margaret, stop right now. He's just a guest and you're 67 years old. Don't make this awkward." But then, another part of me, one I hadn't listened to in years, whispered, "But he makes you feel alive. He reminds you that you're still a woman, not just an old lady." I got out of bed, heading to the kitchen to get some water and calm myself down. As I passed the living room, I noticed a faint glow coming from the slightly ajar door. Peeking through, I saw Jordan sitting on the couch, a laptop balanced on his lap. The light from the screen illuminated the sharp lines of his youthful face. I stood there for a few moments, unsure if I should knock or walk away. Finally, I decided to push the door open just a bit. "Jordan," I called softly. He flinched, almost slamming his laptop shut. "Oh, Mrs. Margaret, I didn't realize you were still awake," he said, his voice slightly uneasy. I smiled lightly, trying to appear unfazed. "I was just getting some water. I saw the light and thought I'd check if you needed anything." Jordan exhaled in relief and shrugged. "No, thank you. I was just watching a movie." "What movie?" I stepped inside, feeling an unusual boldness. He looked at me for a moment, as if deciding whether to answer, then said, "The Conjuring." "I like horror films," I chuckled. "Well, I won't bother you then. Horror isn't really my thing. My old heart can't handle it." "Not at all. Mrs. Margaret, you're welcome to stay if you'd like." "I don't mind," he said, scooting over to make room. I hesitated briefly, then thought, "Come on, Margaret. It's just a movie. I sat down beside him, keeping a polite distance, though I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The movie continued, but my focus wasn't entirely on the screen. Whenever a jump scare occurred, I found myself inching a little closer, and Jordan, noticing this, chuckled softly. "Don't worry, Mrs. Margaret. I've got you." His words, though light-hearted, made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. I laughed quietly, brushing off his comment, but inside it was a different story. How long had it been since someone said they'd protect me? I couldn't even remember. My marriage, though it had its good moments, had ended in cold silence, leaving me to fend for myself. But here, beside Jordan, something inside me lit up, a fleeting sense of being cared for. The movie ended with its eerie score, but the quiet in the room felt heavier, more intimate. I stood, intending to wish Jordan a good night and leave. But he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a tender warmth. "Mrs. Margaret," he began, his voice soft, "there's something I want to say." I paused, feeling my heart catch in my chest. "Yes, Jordan?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly and shook his head. "No, it's nothing. I just wanted to thank you for making me feel so at home. It really means a lot." I smiled back, trying to suppress the emotions bubbling up inside me. "Jordan, this is your home for the summer, too. I'm happy to have you both here." I returned to my room, but sleep eluded me that night. Jordan's smile, his eyes, the way he made me feel alive, kept playing over and over in my mind. Along with it came an inner conflict I couldn't shake. How could I feel this way about a young man in his 20s? I had lived over 6 decades, and I understood one thing very clearly. This wasn't right. But the heart, oh, it has a way of defying logic. In the days that followed, I tried to keep things normal. I cooked, chatted with Ethan, and maintained a deliberate distance from Jordan. But he had a way of drawing my attention, a playful remark while helping set the table, a quick smile as I passed through the yard. And slowly, I started to notice something. Jordan wasn't just kind and charming. He noticed me too. One afternoon, Ethan went out to meet some friends, leaving just Jordan and me at home. I was tending to a few potted plants on the porch when Jordan walked over, carrying a glass of lemonade. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing it to me. I smiled. "Thank you, Jordan. Where's Ethan?" "He said he'd be back late. I think he has a date or something," Jordan replied with a laugh as he sat down beside me on the steps. For a few moments we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the birds chirping and the soft breeze rustling through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, a moment we both seemed to savor. "Mrs. Margaret," Jordan said, breaking the stillness, "have you ever thought about starting over?" The question stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure. But sometimes I think that no matter how old we are, we can find something new, something that makes us feel truly alive." His eyes met mine, full of sincerity, so much so that I couldn't look away. I didn't know how to respond. His words touched something deep within me, a place I'd long buried under practicality and routine. I smiled softly and said, "Jordan, I think you're right. Sometimes we need to let ourselves feel, even if it's just for a moment." After that, we sat in silence again, both seemingly lost in thought. I felt like I had revealed too much, as though I'd allowed a glimpse of emotions I wasn't sure I had the courage to face. Then Jordan spoke again, gently breaking the quiet. "Mrs. Margaret, I think you have a special kind of presence," he said, his voice warm but steady. I turned to him, startled by the unexpected compliment. "A presence?" "I'm not sure what you mean by that, Jordan," I said, trying to laugh off the awkwardness. He shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "No, I mean it. You have this calmness, this light about you. It's not something you try to have. It's just who you are." I felt my heart thud in my chest, as if his words had awakened something I thought had long been dormant. But I also knew I had to keep my distance. "Jordan, you're a bright young man, with a promising future ahead of you. Your words are very sweet, but I think they're just courtesy," I said, keeping my tone light. Jordan looked at me, his eyes full of quiet determination. He didn't argue, but I could tell he disagreed. Instead, he changed the subject. "Would you like to take a walk around the garden? Fresh air might do us some good." I nodded. We wandered through the small garden, talking about simple things. The flowers I had planted, my memories of Portland in my younger years, and his dreams for the future. Jordan shared that he wanted to work in a creative field, maybe design or photography. "I want to create something that leaves a mark, you know? I want people to look at my work and feel something real." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of pride. "You'll do that, Jordan. The way you see the world, I have no doubt about it." As we continued walking, I realized that no matter how much I tried to maintain a safe distance, Jordan had a way of breaking through every barrier I'd put up. There was something about him, his honesty, his calm demeanor, and the way he made me feel seen and heard, that made me want to set aside all logic. When the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the garden, Jordan turned to me. "Mrs. Margaret, I know some things aren't easy to say, but I feel like there's a connection between us. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I think you need to know this." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jordan," I whispered, unsure of what to say or even how to feel. I stood frozen, my heart seemingly skipping a beat. "Jordan," "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I just want you to know that, in this short time, I've learned so much from you. Not just about living, but about truly feeling." I couldn't respond, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. My heart wanted to align with the emotions in that moment, but my mind kept pulling me back. I offered him a soft smile, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jordan, thank you. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever feel again." We stood there as the evening light bathed us in golden hues. Two people caught in a delicate dance of emotions, each grappling with feelings they couldn't fully comprehend. It was a moment I would never forget. That evening, the house returned to its familiar stillness. I tried to occupy myself with routine, washing dishes, tidying the table, rearranging small objects. But my thoughts were elsewhere. Jordan's words echoed in my mind, especially the way he spoke about connection, with such genuine emotion in his eyes. It was impossible to dismiss, and it left me more unsettled than ever. After finishing my chores, I decided to head to bed early, hoping to escape the storm of thoughts swirling inside me. But lying there in the quiet of my room only made things worse. The feelings Jordan had stirred in me, vitality, recognition, were overwhelming and impossible to ignore. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I left my room to get a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I noticed a faint glow spilling through the slightly open door. The soft sound of typing reached my ears. Jordan was still awake. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked lightly on the door. "Jordan!" I called softly. He looked up, surprised, but quickly smiled his familiar warm smile. "Mrs. Margaret, you're still up?" I stepped into the room, holding my glass of water. "Couldn't sleep. I saw the light and figured you couldn't either." Jordan chuckled, closing his laptop. "Just going over some materials. Would you like to sit down?" I nodded, taking a seat in the chair opposite him. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I felt a little awkward, but Jordan seemed completely at ease. "Mrs. Margaret," he began, breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something, if you don't mind?" "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you ever felt stuck? Like you're living in a box where everything is predetermined, but something's missing, something that makes life feel truly alive?" His question stopped me cold. I looked into his earnest eyes and felt like he was peering straight into my soul. "Jordan, I think I've lived that way for years," I admitted. "I've gotten used to being on my own, to the quiet. But sometimes I do wonder if there's something different out there." Jordan leaned forward slightly, his gaze gentle yet resolute. "Then why not try? Step out of that box. Do something new. Something that makes you feel alive." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "Jordan, I'm 67 years old. What do you think someone my age could possibly do?" "Age doesn't matter, Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "I think the human heart doesn't have an age. If you feel something, anything, you owe it to yourself to experience it." I didn't know what to say. His words, the confidence, in his tone, seemed to chip away at the walls I had built around my heart over the years. All I could do was look at him, feeling a tide of emotions rising within me, emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. As I stood up to leave, Jordan reached out and gently took my hand. I froze, the warmth of his touch sending a jolt through me. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice lowering, "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I think we both feel something. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But if I'm not, I hope you won't deny it." I turned back to him, meeting his gaze. My heart pounded as if the world had paused in that instant. "Jordan," I whispered, "this isn't easy." "I know," he replied, holding my gaze. "But sometimes the hardest things are the ones that matter most." I couldn't argue with him. I let myself be drawn into the moment, and before I knew it, he gently pulled me closer. Our kiss was soft yet brimming with emotion, a culmination of everything we'd both been feeling. When we parted, his eyes sparkled with warmth, while I felt an overwhelming mix of exhilaration and fear. "Jordan," I murmured. "We have to be careful." He nodded. "I understand. But I think, sometimes, allowing ourselves to feel something is its own way of living truthfully." After that kiss, I stood still for a moment, trying to untangle the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. I looked at Jordan, who had just brought a surge of life into my heart, one so powerful it felt like it might burst. He didn't say anything further, just kept his gaze gentle and respectful, as if waiting for me to decide what would come next. "Jordan, I'm not sure I can do this," I whispered, trying to steady my voice despite the turmoil inside. This is very complicated," he nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I understand. I don't want to make you feel pressured or uncomfortable, But I want you to know that I value this moment deeply, and I don't regret it." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to escape this situation, retreat to the safe and familiar life I'd always known. But another part of me, stronger and more daring, longed to hold on to this feeling, the sense of being alive, of being loved, of being seen, not as an aging woman, but as a whole, vibrant person. "I need time," I said, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Give me some time to think, okay?" Jordan smiled softly and released my hand. "Mrs. Margaret, take all the time you need. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." I nodded, relieved that he wasn't pushing me. I returned to my room, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easily that night. My thoughts were split in two, one half urging me to stop now and preserve the dignity I'd upheld for so many years, and the other half whispering that perhaps it was time to push boundaries, to embrace something I never thought possible at my age. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. Ethan appeared first, entirely oblivious to the emotional storm raging inside me. "Grandma, I got back late last night, but today I'm taking Jordan to explore Portland. He hasn't seen much of the city yet." I smiled, feeling a sense of relief that Ethan's presence could act as a buffer for my disordered emotions. "That sounds like a great idea. You two have fun. I'll stay home and get some cleaning done." Jordan entered the kitchen shortly after, his familiar smile lighting up his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret." I worked hard to keep my voice steady. "Good morning, Jordan. Did you sleep well?" He nodded, a playful glint in his eye that only I noticed. "Very well, thank you." Breakfast went on as usual, but beneath the surface I could feel an unspoken tension between Jordan and me. It wasn't an uncomfortable tension, but rather a sense that everything was teetering on the edge of change. When Ethan left to meet some friends, Jordan stayed behind. I was tending to some potted plants on the porch when he appeared, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "I think you could use this," he said, placing a glass on the small table next to me. I smiled, grateful. "You're very thoughtful, Jordan." We sat quietly for a few moments, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the garden. Time seemed to slow down, and the silence between us felt peaceful, not awkward. Then Jordan spoke, breaking the stillness. "Mrs. Margaret, can I ask you something else?" I turned to look at him, the familiar pull from the previous night returning. "What is it, Jordan?" "Do you ever feel like life still has so much left to offer, even when people think it's all settled?" His question stopped me in my tracks. He always had a way of reaching deep into the places I'd kept hidden for so long. I met his gaze, his eyes sincere and steady. "Jordan, I think we always have the chance to start again. But starting over isn't easy." He smiled, leaning forward slightly. "No, it's not easy. But it's worth it, don't you think?" I stayed silent, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that if I said one more word, everything might change forever. His question lingered in the air, like a gentle breeze that left its mark long after it had passed. I couldn't bring myself to answer right away. Instead, I reached for the lemonade, my hand trembling just enough to spill a few drops. Jordan noticed immediately but didn't comment. Instead, he lightly placed his hand on the table, close enough to mine that I could feel his steady presence. "Jordan, I don't know if I can," I said softly, avoiding his eyes. "You're young and I—" He interrupted gently, his voice calm but firm. "Age doesn't matter, Mrs. Margaret. I believe the heart doesn't have an age. If you feel something, anything, You owe it to yourself to let it happen, even for a moment." I didn't know what to say. His words delivered, with such conviction, chipped away at the walls I had carefully built around my heart for decades. I found myself looking at him, a wave of emotion rising within me that I couldn't control. As I stood to leave, Jordan suddenly reached out and took my hand. I froze, feeling the warmth of his touch. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice dropping to a tender tone. "I don't want to make this harder for you, but I think we both feel something. And if I'm wrong, I'll apologize. But if I'm not, I hope you won't turn away." I turned to face him, my heart racing as if the world had stopped in that instant. "Jordan," I whispered, This isn't easy." "I know," he replied, his gaze steady. "But sometimes, the things that aren't easy are the ones most worth pursuing." I couldn't argue with him. I allowed myself to be swept up in that moment, and before I could second-guess, I let him pull me closer. His kiss was gentle, filled with emotions that words couldn't capture. It was as though everything we'd been holding back was finally unleashed in that single profound connection. When we pulled apart, his eyes sparkled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. And me? I didn't know whether to feel joy or fear. "Jordan," I murmured, "we have to be careful." He nodded. "I understand, but I think letting ourselves feel something is a part of truly living." "Mrs. Margaret," he interrupted, his smile gentle yet resolute. "I just want you to know that what you're feeling isn't wrong, and I'm willing to wait if you need me to." I couldn't respond right away, but the sincerity in his eyes stirred something deep within me, something I thought had long been dormant. "Jordan, it's not right," I said, though my voice sounded more like I was trying to convince myself than him. He nodded, as if he fully understood the turmoil inside me. "I know you're worried, but sometimes what feels most right isn't what society tells us it should be. I just want you to know I'm here, and I won't push you into anything." His words felt like a gentle balm, soothing, yet making me think deeply. I didn't reply, sitting silently instead, feeling my heart race, faster than it had in years. Perhaps Jordan was right. Maybe I needed to allow myself to feel something, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. That evening, Ethan still hadn't come home. I sat in the living room, flipping through a book I couldn't focus on. My mind was consumed by thoughts of Jordan and our conversation earlier. I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, and soon enough Jordan appeared. "You're still up?" he asked, standing in the doorway with a cup of tea in hand. "Yes, I couldn't sleep," I admitted, setting the book down. "What about you?" "Same," he replied, stepping into the room and settling into the chair across from me. There was a shift in the atmosphere between us, not the hesitant politeness from the first days, but an intimacy that was hard to put into words. Jordan placed his tea on the table and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Margaret, I don't want to make you feel pressured, but I also don't want to miss the chance to say this. I think you're remarkable, not just for everything you've done for me and Ethan, but for who you are, your warmth, your strength, and the way you make everything feel lighter." I realized I couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. Placing my hands on the table, I met his gaze. "Jordan, I need you to understand that this isn't easy for me. I've lived a life where everything has clear boundaries, but you've made everything more complicated, and at the same time made me feel more alive than I ever have." He smiled, a smile so disarming it made my heart skip a beat. I just want you to know that sometimes breaking those boundaries isn't a mistake. Sometimes it's the only way to truly live. I looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, all my logic, all my fears, disappeared. I stood up and moved closer to him. "Jordan," I said softly, "if this is a mistake, let me make it." He stood, his eyes lighting up with hope. "It's not a mistake, Mrs. Margaret." And then, in the quiet of that room, we let our emotions lead us. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But in that moment, I knew I had decided to live. For myself. For once. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the window, gently pulling me from sleep. The room was as still as ever, yet inside me, everything had changed. I glanced around, realizing I was alone in my familiar old bed, and the memories of the previous night washed over me like a powerful wave. I sat up, my heart both fluttering and heavy with worry. Last night I'd allowed myself to cross boundaries I never thought I would. But instead of regret, I felt an unexpected calm, as though a part of me had awakened after years of being buried beneath solitude and self-imposed restraint. I stepped into the kitchen to prepare breakfast as usual. Ethan wasn't up yet, but I knew Jordan would appear soon. As expected, he walked in a few minutes later, a gentle smile on his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," he said warmly, though his tone carried a hint of caution. I managed a smile, masking the unease I felt inside. "Good morning, Jordan. Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," he replied, his eyes subtly searching mine. Perhaps for reassurance, or maybe for a sign that I didn't regret what had happened. We sat at the table saying little. The air between us was both tender and charged, as though we were both trying to make sense of our feelings and each other's. I wasn't sure where to begin, but before I could find the words, Jordan spoke. "Mrs. Margaret," he began, his eyes locking onto mine. "I don't want you to feel any pressure. If last night left you feeling uncertain, I will completely respect whatever you decide." I set down my fork, meeting his gaze. "Jordan, last night, it's something I never imagined would happen. But I don't regret it. I'm worried. About everything. About the age difference. About Ethan. About how people would see this." Jordan nodded thoughtfully, his expression gentle yet resolute. "I understand, and I know those concerns are valid. But I also believe that sometimes what truly matters isn't how others see us. It's how we feel, and whether we're willing to give ourselves permission to embrace that." Jordan gave a soft smile, resting his hand gently on the table, as if to offer reassurance. "I understand, and I'm not expecting an answer from you right now. I just want you to know that for me, those moments were real, and I'm willing to take things as slowly as you need, so you feel safe." His words felt like a life raft in the sea of emotions that had been overwhelming me. I nodded, unsure if I had made any concrete decision, but certain of one thing. I wasn't alone. Ethan woke up and strolled into the kitchen, entirely unaware of any shift in the dynamic between me and Jordan. He ate breakfast, chatting about his plans for the day. A meet-up with friends and maybe a visit to a couple of small museums around Portland. I felt a sense of relief at Ethan's presence, his lively energy restoring a semblance of normalcy. Yet, it also made me acutely aware that whatever existed between me and Jordan was anything but simple. It wasn't just our story. It was intertwined with Ethan, with family, and with the weight of societal norms and expectations. Later that evening, once Ethan had gone to bed, Jordan and I sat together on the porch. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the garden, which he had helped me tend over the past few days. The atmosphere between us was quiet but not tense, as though we both understood that it was time to speak openly. "Jordan," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "We can't pretend this is simple. You're young, and I've been through so much. Whatever this is, as beautiful as it might be, it's bound to face challenges." He nodded, his expression filled with empathy. "I know, and I don't expect you to set those worries aside, but I also believe that sometimes the most worthwhile things in life are never easy." I smiled faintly, feeling a warmth spread through my chest at his understanding. "Jordan, I don't know if I have the courage to face everything this might bring, but I do know that I treasure what we've had." His eyes softened, his gaze filled with tenderness. "Mrs. Margaret, I don't need an answer now. I just want you to know that whenever you're ready, I'll be here." In the days that followed, life carried on as usual, at least on the surface. Ethan remained blissfully unaware of anything amiss, while Jordan and I carefully maintained a respectful distance. Still, the stolen glances and subtle smiles between us spoke volumes, unable to completely mask what lay beneath. As the summer drew to a close and Ethan prepared to return to Boston, I accompanied the two young men to the airport. Before getting into the car, Jordan lightly took my hand, his touch as gentle as his words. "I hope you'll think about what I said," he murmured. I could only nod, my throat too tight with emotion to say anything. As their car rolled away, I stood on the porch, watching the familiar stillness settle over my home once more. But this time I knew that stillness was different. Within me, something had shifted. A seed had been planted, a seed of hope, of awakening, and of possibilities I had never dared to imagine.